Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. My name is Brianne Reel, and I'm very pleased to announce the launch of our Canada Energy Dashboard today. It's a resource we're excited to be providing and one that we're hopeful you will find useful in your work. A couple of housekeeping things up front. If you're having any issues with your stream, just click on the help button in the lower right corner of the webcast. And if you'd like to ask a question at any point throughout the webcast today, just click on the question tab and you can type your question in there. I encourage you to do that. I will be leading you through a demo of our dashboard today. I'd also like to introduce Jotham Peters, who is the modeling genius behind the dashboard we'll be showing you today.
Yeah, welcome everyone. So first of all, I'd like to start off by thanking both NRCan as well as my team for supporting this project. NRCan provided funding and my team provided a ton of support. And without that support, this project would have never got done. This is the first time we provide our data publicly in this way. And so our hope is that this tool will be very easily usable for anybody that has an interest in climate policy. And the last thing I'll say is that we're not done. And now that this tool is built, we're hoping to continually update it. And hopefully it'll be a resource that people can come back to. Thank you.
Thanks, Jotham. You will hear more from him during the Q&A. So again, we encourage you to submit questions if you have any, and we'll look forward to answering those after the demo. For those of you who aren't familiar with Navius, we are a consulting firm based in Vancouver, and we use energy economy modeling to simulate the impacts of climate and energy policy for clients across Canada. This particular project, as Jonathan mentioned, has been done with the generous support of Natural Resources Canada. And we developed the Canada Energy Dashboard with two key objectives. The first objective was to improve our modeling capabilities by accounting for both the hourly detail of the electricity system and the wider macro economy in one fully integrated model. As we all know, Canada has committed to achieve net zero emissions by 2050, and electrification of our economy is likely to play an important role in our net zero future. For this reason, the expansion of our model was an important step for improving our understanding of what net zero means for Canada's electricity system and the cost of electrification. Secondly, Canada is lacking publicly available modeling resources for Canadians to explore alternative futures for our energy system and economy. And this is why NRCan funded us to provide this dashboard to help fill this gap by sharing results from our newly integrated model as a public resource for anyone to use. Before showing you the dashboard, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the modeling behind the results. Some of you are familiar with our energy economy model called GTEC. GTEC is an economic model that, as you can see here, provides insight into how climate policy affects emissions, energy consumption, technology adoption, and economic activity across Canada. As an annual macroeconomic model, its representation of the electricity sector is simplified, and it misses some important hourly dynamics in this sector. In the past, we have used a separate model called IESD, which represents the electricity sector in much more detail and provides insight into hourly electricity supply, storage, electricity price, and trade. And these two models, GTEC and IESD, have communicated at a very rudimentary level in the past, but now we have fully integrated them together. And by doing this, we can capture policy impacts on Canada's broader economy, emissions, and technology without compromising the detail that we know is important for the electricity sector. So when we say fully integrated, what we mean is that GTEC now tells IESD what electricity demand is in a given scenario, and then IESD communicates back to GTEC relevant information about the electricity sector, such as what the cost of electricity production is, what the generation mix is, and then GTEC can use that information to inform what abatement options are adopted based on how expensive electrification is, and also how the economy is impacted by the electricity sector. This is an exciting expansion of our modeling capabilities, and it allows us to more accurately answer questions that are very relevant when we're thinking about our net zero future. That includes questions like, what role will electrification play in Canada's net zero future as it competes with other abatement options? How does the cost of electricity supply impact electrification outcomes across Canada? And how does electrification and the cost of electricity supply impact Canada's economy? Using the fully integrated model, we ran over 300 scenarios of Canada's energy future with these questions in mind. So now let's take a look at the dashboard and I'll show you how you can use it to help answer these questions. When you first enter the website at canadaenergydashboard.com, you can select a language here, and then you can select the region that you're interested in looking at. So you can select any province with the exception of the Atlantic provinces, which are grouped together as one, and the territories which are not yet included. This was done to simplify modeling runtime for this first release of the dashboard, but these regions are something that we hope to add moving forward. I will select all of Canada by selecting the maple leaf. And when you enter the dashboard, you will see a control panel on the left. Here you can select a policy scenario, either legislated or net zero policy. Legislated policy includes all federal and provincial policies legislated as of the beginning of this year, including a carbon tax that rises to $170 per ton and the clean fuel regulation. It doesn't include any policies announced in the federal emissions reduction plan. And then net zero policy simulates an economy-wide cap and trade system that requires Canada to achieve its 2030 emissions target and net zero emissions by 2050. In the control panel, you can also vary the cost of low carbon technologies, including solar, wind, and battery costs, carbon capture and storage costs, hydrogen costs, which includes hydrogen production costs and hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. And you can vary these from low to reference to high. You can also vary the global oil price forecast that is used. We have a low or a reference oil price based on the Canadian Energy Regulator. And finally, you can vary the availability of emissions offsets, including whether or not direct air capture technology becomes commercially available, as well as how many land use offsets are used to help achieve net zero. You can see a summary of these policy and technology assumptions if you hold your cursor over the lever. And if, for those of you who want to understand these assumptions in more detail, you can see that in the downloadable model documentation, which you can access by selecting download here in the bottom right. I'll show you what that looks like in a moment. Results of the scenario that you select are then provided in 4 different dashboards, which you can see along the top here. The first dashboard and a key focus area is the electricity system, where you can find electricity demand by sector, capacity and generation by source, cost of electricity generation, storage adoption, and peak load. You can also see the value of each portion of the figure by holding your cursor over the graph, and you can focus on a particular sector or a subset of sectors that you're interested in by double-clicking on the legend and selecting them. Next is the energy and emissions dashboard, where you find emissions by sector, energy consumption by sector and fuel, change in energy consumption over time, primary energy production, and the portion of energy consumption that is renewable. Third is the technology dashboard, where you can find adoption of key low carbon technologies. This includes electric vehicles, heat pumps, carbon capture and storage, direct air capture, hydrogen, and biofuels. And finally, the economy dashboard provides information on GDP and jobs economy-wide, as well as GDP growth and investment in the low carbon economy. We define the low carbon economy here as the portion of the economy made up of technologies, services, and resources that increase renewable energy supply and help to reduce emissions. if you select download in the bottom right corner here, you can download the model documentation, as I mentioned. I'll show you that here. The documentation tells you all about the models and the integration, about the scenarios that are provided on the dashboard, as well as some detailed technology assumptions. And you can also download data here, either for a specific region or for all regions. That's if you want to be able to explore this data on your own computer. So I'll show you that here as well. If I select Canada, the data will download into a CSV file, and then you can see the data behind all of the figures that you find on the dashboard. And finally, in the top right corner here, if you select this question mark, it brings you to some FAQs about the dashboard and the data behind it that you might find helpful. And if you select Insights here, we've put together a few key insights that we think can be drawn from the dashboard, which you also might find interesting. I won't go into these right now, but encourage you to take a look. Okay, so now that we have our bearings, let's go back to some of those questions that I said this integrated model can help us answer, and I'll use those to demonstrate how you can use the dashboard. The first question we can answer is, what role does electrification play in Canada's net zero future? We know that in a net zero future, electricity demand is expected to increase as we electrify our economy, and this is something we can explore using the dashboard. So we're looking at all of Canada right now, and under legislated policy, we see that electricity demand is increasing from about 600 terawatt hours in 2020 to 900 terawatt hours in 2050. If we look at a net zero scenario, we see that electricity demand increases even more to 1100 terawatt hours in 2050. And there are many parts of the economy that are electrifying, which is driving this increase in demand. We see residential and commercial buildings, the transport sector, and the industry sector electrifying. And this raises another question, which is, how does Canada generate electricity supply to meet this increased demand? We can see this in the electricity generation figure here, that the increase in demand is being primarily met by increased renewable generation. So here's legislated policy, and under net zero policy, we see a significant increase in both wind and solar generation, which increases from about 35 terawatt hours in 2020 to 600 terawatt hours in 2050 in this scenario. And this increase in demand will present a challenge for our electricity sector, as you can see in the peak load figure below here. So this figure is showing the hour in each year with the highest demand for electricity Canada-wide, called peak load. And you can see that peak load is increasing significantly over time as our economy electrifies under net zero. It more than doubles from 100 gigawatts in 2020 to about 225 gigawatts in 2050 in this scenario. And this is a result of increased demand for space heating on peak as we electrify our buildings, as well as increased demand from transportation on peak as we electrify our vehicles. And this increased peak load, in combination with a more intermittent grid, creates a challenge for our electricity system, because in Canada, when this peak demand for space heating is occurring at night in the winter, is not when the sun is shining. And so that is driving a market for electricity storage, which allows us to move intermittent renewable generation from when it's available to when it's needed. And you can see that in the electricity storage figure here, which shows an increase in adoption of short duration storage capacity. Short duration storage capacity is increasing from 160 gigawatt hours in 2050 under legislated policy to 500 gigawatt hours in 2050 under net zero policy. And you can see almost 150 gigawatt hours of longer duration storage kicking in 2050 here as well. And this confirms that electricity demand is expected to increase in a net zero future as Canada's economy electrifies, and suggests that this increased demand will be primarily met by increases in renewables and storage supply. And we can go a step further as well by looking at these levers here in the control panel. So we can use the solar, wind, and battery cost lever to answer the question, how does the cost of electricity supply impact electricity demand and the role of electrification in a net zero future? If we look at a net zero scenario where solar, wind, and battery costs come down more over time, for example, we see that electricity demand increases from 1,100 terawatt hours here in 2050 under reference assumptions to about 1,200 terawatt hours. And this happens as electrification becomes a more cost competitive abatement option to achieve net zero emissions. We can also see that this increase in demand is leading to increased renewable generation supported by battery storage. Similarly, if we look at a net zero scenario where solar, wind, and battery costs don't come down as much, we see less electricity demand in 2050, about 1,000 terawatt hours, as electrification is a more expensive abatement option. In this case, we're actually seeing some new nuclear capacity coming online in 2050 and a little less renewables to meet demand. So we find that changes in the cost of electricity supply impact electricity demand and the generation mix. And we can go a step further as well. So this change in electricity demand that we see is people making many different decisions. People using electricity to heat their homes instead of natural gas, people using electric vehicles instead of internal combustion engine vehicles. And so we can use the technology dashboard to look in more detail at where this electricity is being used. So for example, we see an increase in demand in the transportation sector here. And the first figure on the technology dashboard is showing total vehicle market share by vehicle type. And in this figure, we can see that net zero policy is leading to an increase in market share of battery electric vehicles in the light duty market and battery electric and hydrogen fuel cell vehicles in the heavy duty market. So looking at light duty vehicles first, we see that under legislated policy, battery electric vehicles are making up about 67% of total light duty market share in 2050. Under net zero policy, there is greater incentive to electrify transportation to reduce emissions. And we see 81% of light duty vehicles are electric in 2050. And this increases further to 89% in 2050 in a scenario with low solar, wind, and battery costs, because electricity production is less costly and therefore the cost of electrifying transport becomes more competitive. In the heavy duty market, we see competition between battery electric and hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. So depending on the cost of those technologies, one can outcompete the other. Under legislated policy, we see a relatively small amounts of electrification in the heavy duty sector because this is an expensive sector to electrify. We see 6% each of battery electric and hydrogen fuel cell vehicles in 2050. Under net zero policy, this increases to 44% market share of battery electric and 16% hydrogen vehicles. However, if we look at a scenario where solar, wind, and battery costs are higher and hydrogen costs are lower, we see that hydrogen fuel cell vehicles start to outcompete battery electric with 39% of market share in 2050. So this is showing us that the heavy duty vehicle market is sensitive to our technology cost assumptions. Going back to the electricity dashboard, another sector that we saw driving this increase in electricity demand under net zero policy is residential and commercial buildings. And the second figure in the technology dashboard is showing you total market share by building heating type. So under net zero policy here, we're seeing a mix of electric baseboard heating and heat pumps in 2050. And this is what is leading to increased demand for electricity in the building sector. In this scenario, you can also see that natural gas furnaces are reducing to 10% of market share in 2050, while electric heat pumps are increasing to 30% of total market share in 2050. And again, we can play around with these technology cost assumptions to see what they do to building heating market share. In this case, we find that the results are not as sensitive to technology cost assumptions. So this result of declining heating from natural gas and an increase in electric heating is consistent across most net zero scenarios. A final question that we will look into today is, how does electrification to achieve net zero impact Canada's economy? And we can explore this by looking at the economy tab. So this value here is, let me put this here. This value here is the average annual GDP growth rate for Canada from 2020 to 2050. Under legislated policy, our economy grows at an average rate of 1.9% per year out to 2050. And if we look at a net zero scenario, our economy grows at a lower rate of 1.4% per year. And this is an important insight. Although Canada's economy grows at a lower rate than in the legislated scenario, our economy does continue to grow under net zero policy. And this is the case in all net zero scenarios that we simulated. And of course, as our economy is growing in this scenario, our emissions are decreasing significantly. And we can see that in the energy and emissions dashboard. So under legislated policy, Canada's emissions remain at about 600 megatons in 2050, while under net zero policy, they decline much more rapidly to net zero in 2050. So going back to the economy tab, we can also look at how the cost of electricity supply impacts Canada's economy. So if we look at a net zero scenario with low solar, wind, and battery costs, we see that Canada's economy grows at a higher rate of 1.5% per year, as it's less costly to electrify and achieve emissions reductions to comply with net zero. On the other hand, if these technologies are higher cost, our economy grows at a slightly slower rate of 1.2% per year, as electrification is more expensive. And we can look at the economic impacts in a particular region as well by selecting the region in the map on the left here. So in Ontario, for example, Ontario's economy grows at an average rate of 2% per year out to 2050 under legislated policy, and 1.6% per year in the net zero scenario. And again, if we look at a scenario with low solar, wind, and battery costs, Ontario's economy grows at a slightly greater rate of 1.7% per year while achieving net zero emissions. So this suggests that the cost of electricity supply has an important impact on the growth of our economy under net zero. And we can look at the portion of our economy that really grows in a net zero future, and that's the low carbon economy. So again, we define this portion of the economy as the portion made up of technologies, services, and resources that increase renewable energy supply and help to reduce emissions. This portion of the economy grows at a greater rate in a net zero future because these are sectors that are incentivized by net zero policy and are important to help us comply with net zero. So under legislated policy, the low carbon economy grows at an average rate of 5.2% per year from 2020 to 2050. And under net zero policy, that increases to 7.1% per year. And this is a result of greater investment in the low carbon economy sectors, which you can see in the investment figure here. So that includes electricity, electric vehicles, biofuels, hydrogen, and carbon capture. In this net zero scenario, we are seeing cumulative investment of almost $3 trillion from 2020 to 2050 in the low carbon economy. And if we look at a scenario with low solar, wind, and battery costs, we see the low carbon economy grows at a slightly higher rate of 7.4% per year. There are many other levers we can play with here that have an important impact. So offset availability, for example, is something we haven't touched on yet that has a significant impact on Canada's economy and the need to electrify to achieve net zero emissions. Direct air capture is a technology that is not yet commercially available, but has the potential to transform our net zero economy by providing the ability to offset emissions by taking CO2 directly out of the atmosphere and storing it underground. If we turn this technology on here, we see a significant impact on economic growth in Canada in a net zero future. And we see that particularly in provinces like Alberta that are very well suited for direct air capture. And we can follow the impact of this technology availability back to the technology dashboard. So here you can see we're getting significant adoption of direct air capture in 2050, over 300 megatons in this scenario. And this impacts the adoption of other technologies as well. So we see less CCS being adopted when direct air capture is available. We also see fewer heat pumps being adopted and fewer electric vehicles. And that's because there's less of a need to electrify these sectors when there are emissions offsets available. We can also go back to the electricity dashboard. And here we see that there is slightly less electricity demand economy-wide when direct air capture is available. But this is not as much of a reduction in electricity demand as you might expect based on the lower adoption of technologies like EVs and heat pumps. And that's because we now have this portion of electricity demand coming from the direct air capture sector itself. Direct air capture is demanding 60 terawatt hours of electricity in 2050 in this scenario, which is a lot. That's equivalent to BC's entire electricity grid today. So even though we aren't electrifying other sectors of the economy as much, our electricity demand is still increasing significantly in this net zero scenario. That is all to say that there are many more questions we can explore with the dashboard, but I would like to wrap it up there to make sure we have time to answer your questions. A quick reminder to please submit those in the question box. And as we're waiting for those to come in, I will pass it to Dave Sawyer to share some of his thoughts on the new Canada Energy Dashboard.
Thank you, Bree. That was an excellent presentation. So I'm really excited about this dashboard. I'm really excited about the data that's going to be available for all of us to basically learn with, to manipulate, to use as a touchstone for discussing and debating various pathways to net zero, pathways to 2030. Thinking about complex technologies that may or may not be available, that may or may not, be available at scale and at the prices that we sort of forecast now. So there's some sensitivities that are involved in here. And the results that we see here represent a really sophisticated modeling effort, and I would argue globally, top tier. We were involved in the deep decarbonization work a number of years ago and continue to be involved globally in these modeling initiatives. And there's not many models that we have access to that allow for really detailed technology competition. So technologies competing against each other with learning, with more deployment, for example. So really deep technology richness, deep energy supply competitions that are going on against emitting and non-emitting technologies. really well articulated policy. I mean, just putting the output-based pricing system into these models is really a challenge, and having that in here and the fuel charge, for example, interacting with the clean fuel regulations is some pretty interesting modeling. And then when you add in this integrated piece with the ISED model, where you have basically load curves being shaped by end use technology that then feed into some sort of supply, including peak load. I mean, I think putting the data up here on the peak demands under deep electrification is really interesting, because that's going to basically impact the type of technologies that we need to have on standby, like fossil generation, perhaps natural gas. We may not like that, but when we start to see these peak loads and the sort of technology characteristics we have in renewables, we have a ton of capacity out, end generation from renewables in these runs, but it's really hard to address these peaks with some of these generating types, including with really detailed storage. So I think this integrated piece is really important, because we all know how important electrification is. And I guess the last thing I want to say is, using this as a touchstone, I mentioned that earlier. We have never had access to this type of data, and myself included, and I've had access to all kinds of Navius and other modeling initiative data for a long time. Having such a large and rich data set that's downloadable, where we can toggle and take a look at various results, is really a huge leap forward, I think, for all of us. And I think it's really empowering, frankly, for the debate in the country. So it allows us to basically use a bunch of data and look at trade-offs and look at some really, really significant and complex outcomes across the economy, across tech deployment, across technology choice, energy supply, etc. So yeah, congratulations to Navius, and of course, congratulations to the other two modeling initiatives, Trache and Pembina. They put out some good analysis as well. And I think between these three data sets, we've just sort of taken a quantum leap forward. So yeah, I'll stop there and say, yeah, I'm really excited. So I like to say, go forth and wonk, folks. Go forth and wonk.
Thanks, Dave. Okay, so we're getting some questions. The first one is, some people are asking for the URL for the dashboard. I'll show you that here. It's just canadaenergydashboard.com. So if you want to go there and play around with it yourself, please do that. Okay, we also got a question asking, what are our definitions of short and long duration storage? So we don't have every single type of storage option in the model. Instead, we use archetypes of storage. For here, we have a short duration archetype and a longer duration archetype. For short duration, we're using lithium ion batteries. You can find our cost assumptions for those in the documentation. And that's typically to store for a few hours. And then for our longer duration storage archetype, we're representing hydrogen storage here for a longer seasonal storage option. Another longer duration storage option that we don't have in this model yet is flow batteries. That is one technology that we see ourselves adding in the future, but for now, we just have these two archetypes. Another related question is why we grouped some of these together in these levers. So why solar, wind, and batteries are grouped together, because they're individual technologies that could have individual cost declines. We can certainly vary the cost of these technologies separately in our model. However, for the purposes of this dashboard and not having, a million scenarios, we grouped a few together so that we could capture the range in possible outcomes for the electricity sector without, having the model take years to solve. So that's why we've grouped them here. We could also see ourselves adjusting these levers in the future as we make updates to the dashboard, and potentially adding other technologies or other sensitivities that we're interested in exploring. Another question is when we think we'll have regional data available for the territories. Good question. At Navius, we work with all territorial governments, so we have versions of our model for each of the territories. Like I mentioned at the beginning, the reason we excluded them here was just to limit model runtime, especially for this first launch. You know, this is our first foray into providing a public resource like this. And so we wanted to simplify it for ourselves as much as possible. We hope to make updates to the Canada Energy Dashboard at least annually, ideally more, as new research becomes available, new technology costs, new data, new policies are announced. And at that point, we would also look to expand to include the territories and to disaggregate the Atlantic provinces as well. Okay, let's see what else we have here. Does this work align with the Canada Energy Regulator energy futures scenarios, or is it entirely independent? Yes, so there was a new CER released on Tuesday this week. Currently, we do use the CER to calibrate the reference case in our model. So this model is calibrated to the previous one, which is the 2021 CER. We use that, for example, we use exogenous oil price forecasts, and these oil price forecasts are based on the CER. So to give you a sense of how that compares to what was released this week, our low oil price forecast assumes oil prices of $35 per barrel in 2050. I believe this sits in between the new CER's global net zero and Canada net zero scenario. And then our reference oil price here assumes a price of $64 per barrel in 2050, which is comparable, I think, to the new CER's current policy scenario, which is $70 per barrel. Okay. Jotham, maybe this is something you can speak to. Someone's asking, wondering why sector categories on the dashboard do not mirror Canada's economic sector breakdown in the National Inventory Report.
Sorry, is this on the energy and emissions tab?
They're probably speaking, yeah, potentially to these sectors and why we have them this way.
So the short answer is they should align fairly closely. So we do our best to disaggregate our greenhouse gas emissions into categories which align fairly closely with the National Inventory Report. On the economic side, then we aggregate our sectors by economic sector. So that's going to have a slightly different disaggregation. But on the emission side, they should align fairly closely with the NIR.
We have another question. Is the cap and trade system to achieve net zero? Does that replace the current system? And where does money collected through the selling of credits go? So in our net zero policy scenario, we include legislated policy as a base. So that includes the $170 carbon tax up to 2030. And then after 2030, we replace the carbon tax with an economy-wide cap that requires us to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. Jotham, you can probably speak to where we're recycling the revenue from that cap in these runs.
I love that question. So we are currently giving all the money back to households, but I do think that is a really, really important assumption. So we know that if we take money and we recycle it back to cut corporate income taxes or personal income taxes, or to provide some sort of investment credit towards certain technologies, they can have a dramatic impact, not only on greenhouse gas emissions, but also on economic activity. So, you know, I mean, I think that I just want to go back to something I said at the beginning, which is that we are really keen on continuing to build this thing. So I think that we want to hear people's questions and get ideas on where we can go next. And if people are really interested in, let's call it a very nerdy revenue recycling debate, that's something that we would love to go do.
We have another question about electric vehicles. So they are asking, with regards to EVs, wouldn't we expect the entire passenger vehicle fleet to be electrified by 2050? Under net zero, I assume. Not necessarily. There's still a ton of internal combustion engine vehicles on the road, and so the stock will need to turn over naturally. In this net zero scenario here, we're seeing a lot of battery electric vehicles in the light duty market, so 81% of total market share. But remember that under net zero, we have some land use offsets assumed here. So in this scenario, we're assuming 103 megatons of land use offsets are available in 2050. So we still have the ability to emit 103 megatons. So that's why the vehicle fleet isn't entirely electrified. If we do a low land use offset assumption, this assumes 50 megatons in 2050, which is, I think, what's in line with the CER that just came out. And we can see what that does here. We have a little bit more electrification of light duty vehicles, but still not 100%. Jonathan, I'm not sure if there's anything you want to add to that.
No, I think that's good. I mean, I think it's important to highlight that a lot of these technologies, it takes a long time for the stock to turn over. So, you know, if you implement a policy today, it's going to take a long time for, you know, to get rid of all the internal combustion vehicles. And so there are likely to be a few internal combustion engines sitting around by 2050.
We're also getting a question about DAC. So how many megatons of reductions does the model show from direct air capture in 2050 if the technology is available? So here I'll turn it on. In this scenario, we're seeing 337 megatons of emissions reductions from direct air capture in 2050. That's a lot. I think we see even more if we have less land use offsets available. This goes up to 400 megatons in 2050. Our cost assumptions for DAC are available in the model documentation. So it starts at $734 per ton. It becomes available in 2035, and then that cost decreases with increased adoption. I forget at the moment what the cost can come down to in this scenario, but I think what that tells us is that, you know, those final few megatons of emissions reductions to get to net zero are really expensive because when we do turn DAC on in the model loves it and it uses it to get rid of those emissions because it's cheaper to do it that way.
I wouldn't mind adding something really quickly on that. You know, to be frank, I'd say the quantity of DAC that we often see from our model makes us feel a little bit uncomfortable. So we often see a lot of it. But if you take a look at what the literature says in terms of where the cost for DAC could potentially go, it suggests that it could potentially be very economic. And this is the outcome of that. So I think that the literature indicates that the cost for DAC could get down to the range of around $150 per ton or so. And that makes a lot of other options a lot more expensive than DAC. And when we add DAC into our model says, well, let's just go do DAC.
Here's another good question for you, Jotham. Are the assumptions associated with the data available, specifically the carbon intensity and associated methodology for hydrogen production?
So we have provided our cost assumptions for electrolysis. We have one gap in our documentation. This is maybe the only one where we have not provided our cost assumptions for SMRs, but if you bear with us for about a week, we can get those in.
Yeah, and maybe you can speak to how carbon intensity works in the model as well, and as it relates to hydrogen production technologies.
Yeah, sure. So the carbon intensity for hydrogen production in our model is endogenous. So basically, we specify that hydrogen production, similar to other sectors of the economy, they demand different end uses. So they demand one end use for actually converting natural gas into hydrogen itself. It's kind of like we call it the steam methane reformation unit. They have another end use, which is required to produce the steam. Each of those two different end uses have different costs associated with greenhouse gas abatement. So the cost from capturing the hydrogen right off of your steam methane reformation unit is a little bit cheaper, whereas the cost of capturing emissions from your heat production are quite a bit more expensive. And so depending on the stringency for policy, we always will see the SMR unit will go and use CCS, mainly because we require that. But the heat unit, as policy stringency goes up, its emissions intensity comes down.
Thank you. We have two related questions here. So what is happening in the US in this net zero scenario, and how much of the economic impact under net zero relies on what Canadians do and what the rest of the world does? So we represent the US in our model as one large region because it's an important trading partner for Canada. In this case, in the net zero scenario, we are assuming that the US is also implementing stringent climate policy in line with net zero. We don't represent the rest of the world in the model, but you can think of the exogenous global oil price forecast as a proxy for climate action globally. If the oil price remains high, and if it's low, there's less demand for Canadian oil because the rest of the world is moving away from fossil fuels. And how much of the economic impact relies on what happens outside of Canada is a really good point. We do find that economic impacts of net zero are sensitive to the global oil price, which you can see here. Here's a low global oil price under net zero. Oh, it's not that sensitive. In some scenarios, it's much more sensitive, and in other regions as well. So if we look at Alberta, for example, it'll be more sensitive to the global oil price. And I think that's an important point, that what happens to our economy under net zero is not just dependent on what we do and decisions our government makes, but it's also reliant on what happens in the rest of the world, which of course we saw in the Canadian Energy Regulator this week as well. Does the net zero scenario assume the intentional phase out of oil and gas production? No, it doesn't. So the net zero scenario, it just simulates policies that have been legislated as of the beginning of this year, and then it adds an economy-wide cap and trade system that requires our economy to get to net zero emissions, but it doesn't impose any other constraints like production constraints on the oil and gas sector. So we can look actually here, we're looking at a net zero scenario. Here is GDP from the oil and gas sector up here. And so you can see that we are still producing oil and gas in 2050 in this net zero scenario. I suspect that if we have direct air capture available, GDP in this sector is higher. If the global oil price is low, GDP in this sector is lower because there's not as much demand for our oil, but that's all in response to these assumptions, changes in these assumptions. It's not in response to any production constraints that we're putting on here. Does the dashboard run the model in the background to solve based on the input, or have different combinations been run and you present those results on the dashboard? Yeah, that's what we do, the second option. So we run these scenarios ourselves. They take a really long time in this new integrated model, and then we upload them to this dashboard. And so on this dashboard right now, there are 324 scenarios that correspond to all these different options that you have to play around with. And like I said, we are likely to add some more in the future as well. Jotham, here's a question for you. Why is DAC so strongly preferred over other carbon capture, utilization, and storage options in scenarios where it's available?
You know, I think that one of the big advantages of direct air capture is that one thing that we repeatedly see in a lot of our net zero runs is that you can get a lot of reductions out of many different end uses relatively cheaply. But there's always a few which are really hard to get out. So for example, we're not very familiar with opportunities for reducing emissions from agricultural soils or manure management, or from enteric fermentation of cattle. So there's a large source of emissions coming from for example, the agriculture sector. And direct air capture provides an opportunity for actually going and getting around those last B emissions. So in some ways, it's less that it's offsetting carbon capture and storage, and it's more that it's actually helping offset all these other emissions, which are really difficult to go reduce.
Thank you. Here's another question for you. Are there any policies that affect peak load or load timing in order to reduce the impact of electrification on peak load? For example, time of use pricing, utility managed vehicle charging.
Really great question. And so we have simulated two opportunities for what we call utility controlled charging. So we allow for utility controlled charging for both the light duty as well as for the heavy duty and actually medium duty vehicles. One of the assumptions that we have put into the model is that currently only 50% of the available fleet will use utility controlled charging, but this is actually something that we can vary in the model. So there are opportunities to reduce up to or shift the load for up to 50% of the load coming in from both light duty as well as heavy duty vehicles. That said, we're also familiar with other opportunities for utility controlled charging. And so, in the past, we've looked at opportunities for utility controlled charging of electric space heating, etc. And so this would be something that we could explore in the future.
Thank you. We have another question. What is driving declines in energy consumption in the net zero scenarios? So we can see here, I'll go to our reference scenario. Under net zero, our energy consumption declines a lot by 2050. And some of this is driven by efficiency improvements as stock turns over. So as people adopt, more efficient vehicle engines, more efficient furnaces, you see that under legislated policy, our energy consumption goes up over time, but not as much as our population goes up because there's some efficiency gains under legislated policy as well. But under net zero policy, most of this reduction in energy consumption is being driven by electrification, because electricity is a more efficient energy source than fossil fuels. So you can see in this energy consumption figure that a larger portion of our energy consumption is electricity over time, and a smaller portion is natural gas and petroleum. And that is what is mainly driving this reduction in energy consumption. We have another question here, which is electrification, as the dashboard illustrates, will create incredible demand for energy storage in the form of batteries. Current battery technologies require significant mining for battery input materials. And asking if we can speak to the environmental impacts of electrification now and in the net zero future. I think this in terms of environmental impacts of mining for batteries isn't something that we weigh in on in this dashboard. I think it's something that a dashboard like this highlights is an important question to think about, but it's not something that we would weigh in on unless, Jotham, there's something that you do want to say about that.
Yeah, our model is very much scoped to energy consumption and greenhouse gas emissions and the environmental impacts of emissions. We haven't examined other environmental impacts, for example, from mining.
Here's another good one for you, Jotham. What kind of variation in GHG intensity by province exists within the model? How does this vary depending on what source of energy is used in each province?
So I wouldn't know that off the top of my head, but I think that the dashboard provides you with the opportunity to go and examine that. So, you know, I think one of the great things about this dashboard is that, you know, the data is downloadable. And so even though I can't actually answer that, you know, directly, because I haven't actually done the analysis myself, what we could do, or what you could do, is you could download the energy consumption by sector. You get energy consumption by fuel. You can go to specific regions if you like. And then you can compare that to GDP in those regions. And then basically dividing the energy consumption by whatever source you want, by the level of GDP in that region, you can ascertain the change in energy intensity per GDP.
Thank you. And I think that's it. So I think we can stop it there. I want to say thank you to everybody for taking the time to attend. The website is officially available to you as of today. Again, here's the URL that you can use to visit the website. It's something we're really excited to be able to offer. It allows you to interact with the results from our model in a pretty detailed way. And we hope that you make use of it and that it helps contribute to your work. So thank you again for joining.